Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. My name is Abby Bloomfield and I am a sophomore at the college, a member of the Student Advisory Committee, and one of the co-chairs of the Fellows and Study Groups program here at the Institute of Politics.
And my name is Shreya Panagrahi and I'm a junior at the college. I'm also a member of the Student Advisory Committee and co-chair of the Fellows and Study Groups program. Before we begin, please note the exit doors located on both the Park side and JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, please walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park.
Please also take a moment to silence your cell phones. You can join the conversation tonight by tweeting with the hashtag IOP Fellows, which can also be found in your program.
Tonight's forum is an opportunity to hear perspectives from the Spring 2018 Institute of Politics resident fellows on a variety of current political issues and how they will address some of these issues in their study groups this semester. The discussion will be moderated by Chief Correspondent for the Washington Post and 2017 Fall Institute of Politics resident fellow Dan Balz.
Members of this semester's resident fellows class include Adam Connor, former executive at Slack Technologies and founder of Facebook's Washington, D.C. office. Ed Gillespie, former chair of the Republican National Committee, White House counselor for President George W. Bush, and Republican nominee for governor of Virginia.
Betsy Hodges, former mayor of Minneapolis, Minnesota. Scott Jennings, campaign advisor to Senator Mitch McConnell, special assistant for President George W. Bush, and CNN political commentator. Symone Sanders, press secretary to Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, strategist at Priorities USA, and also a CNN political commentator.
Please join us in welcoming our guests to the stage.
Hi, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for being here. My name's Dan Balz. I work for the Washington Post. Last fall, I had the privilege of being in the seats that these folks are in as a fall fellow. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm happy to be back to moderate the forum for the new group. You've heard a little bit about each of them. We'll learn more about them tonight. We will have conversation for about 35 or 40 minutes. Then we will turn it over to you for questions. There are microphones there and in the balconies. Please make your questions brief and make sure that the last sentence ends with a question mark. And with that, I also want to welcome all the students who are here for the national conference for this weekend. You've got a big and important topic to deal with, and good luck in figuring out the future. We will talk a little bit about that tonight. It's interesting, when we were here last fall doing this, the title of this session was called Protest, Partisanship, and Fixing Politics. That is the title we're using again tonight, which I guess should tell us that things haven't changed dramatically in the last 5 months. So let's talk about different aspects of that. I want to start with a question for Ed Gillespie. Ed, you recently did a podcast with David Axelrod, who runs the Institute of Politics at the University of Chicago. And one of the things you said in there that attracted attention was you said that you would not necessarily urge people you know to run for office at this particular time because there's a poisonous atmosphere. Give people in this room a sense of what that looks like from the ground as a candidate, and particularly, you and I go back a long time. We've seen a lot of different periods in politics. What defines this as perhaps more poisonous than some of what we've been through before?
I'd say there are a number of factors. And first, let me just tell folks here, it's wonderful to be here, and it's great to be a fellow, and our fellow fellows have enjoyed our time together, and we're looking forward to the next couple of months. I am going to leave. I see they've got a big clock up there, just so folks know I'm going to leave at 6 because I'm trying to catch a flight. So if I rush out of here, it's not because of something anyone said when I leave. If I leave at 5:30, it's because of something somebody said. One of the things I saw, we are in a very polarized environment. Now, we've been in polarized environments before, but it's a very polarized environment. There are a number of factors. One, I would say that, it has been happening for some time. One of the things I cite is the National Journal has this rating of the United States Senate and the House from most liberal to most conservative, and they've had it for decades. And when I first started working on Capitol Hill in the Senate, you would have 4 or 5 Democrats who would be to the right of 4 or 5 Republicans in the Senate. And so Sam Nunn would be to the right of Arlen Specter or Lincoln Chafee. And now the most liberal Republican, or the most liberal Republican, probably I would say maybe Susan Collins on that ranking, is to the left of the most conservative Democrat, probably Joe Manchin. There's no overlap, and so there's no middle. And that kind of reflects the political dynamic in the country. So it is polarized too. Social media has contributed incredibly to it, I think. And I mean, Twitter's just a cesspool. It is really toxic. And
I like to think of it as a septic tank because it's a closed environment.
It is. People swim in it. And
Such nice metaphors here.
And that's not just limited in Facebook to a lesser extent, or maybe not, but it's not just limited to that. It does feed into, I think, the broader kind of political dynamic and the broader media coverage, which has also become increasingly polarized. And then the third thing is, obviously, President Trump is a very polarizing figure, and he polarizes the electorate in a very significant way. Now, I would have every day 3 Republicans who would come up to me and say, "You have got to stand up for President Trump." And every day 3 Republicans would come up to me and say, "You have got to stand up to President Trump." And, there's no middle ground. And if you're, and this is true on the Republican side, it's not so much a problem or a challenge on the Democratic side, but if you're a Republican, if you are not vocally for the president and talking in his favor every day, then, and this is true actually across the electorate, but in Republicans in particular, then if you're not for him vocally, then you're against him.
Excuse me.
But
you
if
mean
you're
to the Republican base.
To the Republican base.
Yeah.
And if you're not against him and criticizing him every day, then you're for him to a broader part of the electorate in the Democratic base. And there's no middle ground. And, I found that because I really tried to focus on, talking about Virginia. And it's an off election year. In a state office, it's going to be even more challenging in an even-numbered year for people running for federal office this year. But I would say, those 3 things. The country has itself become more polarized. We've divided ourselves more politically. There's less overlap between Democrats and Republicans in the middle. 2, social media fuels a lot of toxicity and poison. And 3, we have a polarizing president.
Mayor Hodges, let me turn to you. You went through a tough campaign this fall also, but at the local level. When you hear what Ed says about the environment, how does that compare with what exists in a local campaign?
Elements of that remain true. It's less polarized at the local level. This country isn't red states and blue states. It's, blue cities and red everything else. So if you're running in a city, the debate is less likely to be a partisan one and more likely to be, how are we going to move forward? But doing it in an environment where everybody is so freaked out all the time, and doing it in an environment where, grassroots folks are feeling like their values are under threat or that their lives are under threat, and especially at a time when, from the national level, cities are under attack and the people who live in them are under attack. It feels like from the federal level and especially from the White House. People are just agitated. People are organizing all the time. And so, to run for office in that environment, especially as an incumbent, is a very challenging thing to do, especially having had 2 very controversial officer-involved shootings while I was mayor. That level of protest, that level of attention. And even though I lost, and even though it was a difficult environment to run in, I'm glad that people are organizing. I'm glad that people are paying attention. I'm glad we're figuring out how to get better and more effective at it. The problems often in cities are that on the left we're adept at eating our young, and we are adept at going after one another instead of the big picture and trying to figure out a way to forge ahead. And so navigating that dynamic on the left at the same time that we're all trying to navigate the dynamic of a conservative agenda for cities that are not conservative is challenging. And then, the social media aspect of that is, God bless the ability to organize so quickly. As an elected official and as someone campaigning, there were some challenges to that. The night people showed up at my house, for example, but which is a story we'll talk about in my study group, which y'all should come to. So it's just challenging at the local level. It's still far more focused on practical things that you can actually do to make people's lives better. Local government feels very removed in many ways from what's happening at the national level. Even we're subject to it, but you still gotta pave the streets.
Was it materially different between your first campaign for mayor and the second campaign for mayor in terms of that climate, the contentiousness, presumably because of the police shootings or other things?
There were a couple things. One, the national environment was very different. My opponents were, it was mystifying to me, but, there was a question about whether or not the mayor of Minneapolis should be talking about what Donald Trump's agenda is for cities. I found that mystifying, that people thought that maybe the mayor shouldn't talk about that. We have the largest Somali population outside of Mogadishu. Donald Trump has specifically called out Minnesota Somali people as a threat and a danger to this country, and I wish he could see the community I see. I wish he had my eyes to see them for just a day, but be that as it may, it was mystifying. So that element was new. The fact that I was an incumbent was new, but the fact that we had the officer-involved shootings, one of them in the middle of the campaign, and that is polarizing, and rightfully or wrongfully, the mayor is held accountable for that, and the base fractures around things like that right now, and we'll be having conversations about that in my study group. All of that led to a more contentious environment, and then gender as well. The tools that people use to run against a woman candidate, whether people are aware of it or not, are very gendered. And there are a lot of people around me who felt that and saw that. And 6 months after I was elected, the local newspaper was purchased by someone very, very conservative, and that had the coverage of me completely changed within 2 months. Because I made a couple decisions that he did not like, and so that made a difference as well. All people saw in this, in the Star Tribune for months was, for years, actually, was all the bad stuff and none of the good stuff, and so that made a difference too.
I want to ask both Symone and Scott this question. You're both CNN contributors. From time to time, you face off on national television. Here's my question. Is cable television constructive at this point in time in terms of the environment that it projects, or destructive? And to what extent are you able to think about that when you're asked to go on and represent your own parties?
I'll say this. I think depending on what cable network you watch, it could be a little more constructive than others. I think what I appreciate and enjoy about my network, CNN, I'm going to speak specifically about where I'm at. I don't think we should editorialize about anybody else. But I think that CNN will say that they want to bring you, quote unquote, all sides. And so if you are the leftist of the left or the rightist of the right, if you are a staunch defender of the current president of the United States, or if you're someone that feels he should be impeached tomorrow, you can come to the network and get all of those things. You can also come if you're someone that's straight up down the middle, and then you make your own decision. I think the problem is that, to my knowledge, there are not media consumption courses being mandated in schools and universities across the country. And everyday regular American people do not understand that when they see somebody like myself or Scott, we are not, in fact, reporters. We are paid individuals to give our partisan perspective on an issue. And what I know I do, and what I appreciate about Scott, is that we try to be very actual and factual and as highbrow as possible in having that conversation. But, as y'all know, everybody don't act like that when they get on television. And that's difficult for the national conversation.
I agree with a lot of what Symone said. I think we've had some really good debates. She's one of the Democrats that I enjoy debating because I actually think we have substantive conversations in a short period. You know, they don't give us a lot of time, but I feel like when Symone and I are on there, we can get a lot in a couple of minutes. Dan, I think the thing that is unhelpful about cable news panels is when they are populated by people who are willing to die on every hill.
Say it again, Scott.
And if
the sky is purple. No, boo, it's blue.
And you can turn on any of the networks and find the people who are willing to die on every hill. These people are the least credible people on television because they're on there defending something or someone or some issue as though that person they're defending or that thing they're defending is right 100% of the time. Well, we're all human beings. Nobody's right 100% of the time. And so I'm the Republican. And most of the time, I'm going to defend the Republican position, but I'm not foolish enough to believe that Republicans are always right, or that the president's always right, or that the party's spin of the day is what I think is the correct message. And so I figured out really quickly, the people that the viewers find the most credible are the ones who don't die on every hill. They're honest, they defend their positions, they have some sort of, inner compass that they basically are moored to, but you can turn on television and find folks defending everything, and to me, that destroys that person's credibility.
To what extent are you all encouraged, subtly perhaps, to die on every hill?
I've never been told one time by anybody what to do or what to say. The only instructions I've ever been given, to CNN's great credit, is we have hired you because we value your perspective and your experience, and that's all we expect you to talk about. And never has a producer, a host, or anyone else said, hey, you may want to knock it off with the pro-Trump stuff tonight, or, hey, you may want to be a little more pro-Trump, we heard there. Never has happened one time, and CNN lets these debates unfold, and I think it's to their great credit, and I think that's why their panels are among the most credible on television.
Absolutely. I would 100% agree. No one has ever told me what to say, how I should say it, suggest I don't say something. At all, and I think that's what's so great, but also so scary because y'all all watch. I hope y'all are all watching CNN, and you have seen some stuff that I'm sure thought, someone told them to say that, and the producers absolutely did not.
To Ed's point, though, what about from your own partisans? What do you hear from your own partisans about how well you are doing in defending the position that they want defended?
Oh, there are people out there that if you are unwilling to go all the way, even to the point of dishonesty in defending your party or your party's people, they're all over you in an instant. And then there are people who oppose you generally that even when you do break with your own party, it's never good enough. So you find people on the fringe of these debates who are desperate for people to validate their own point of view. And when you don't exactly validate it to the extent they want it validated, it makes them really upset.
Very mad, very mad. I think particularly for the Democratic Party and folks that identify as progressives and people on the left, it's a little bit different because I think there are so many more factions that make up the Democratic Party some of them are warring factions currently right now. So I think in general, there's a general distaste and dislike for Donald Trump and the way that the Republicans, particularly on the Hill, have conducted themselves as of late. So everyone is all in on one accord on that. But when it comes specifically talking about things such as the Me Too movement and when there were Democratic members of Congress whom came under fire of the Me Too movement for their own actions, there was fraction there. There was friction. People didn't, I was one of the individuals that came out and said, I think we need to have one standard across the board. And they're like, does that mean you think Al Franken should lose his job? I said, I think we need to have one standard across the board. So if folks are losing their job for sexual misconduct, yes. And that was not a popular position with a lot of people. But again, no one tells me what to say. I think that's also the freedom that we enjoy is that I do take checks for some people, but I don't actually work for anybody.
Dan, I'll add one other thing. One thing I like about what they've done with bringing on a couple of new people, including myself lately, is I think they've tried to diversify some of their panelists so that they don't all live in New York and Washington. I'm the only CNN panelist from Dawson Springs, Kentucky, and so frequently my job is to be I'm a Republican partisan, but also my job to me, to some degree, is to translate from Red America. and here's the news of the day, and here's what the Beltway people are going. Here's the conventional wisdom, but here's how it looks in Red America. You may not like it, or you may like it, but offering that perspective on the network, I think is a good thing for them to do.
Adam, I want to bring you in on this, again, related to something Ed said, which is the role of social media. You more than anybody on this panel, have had direct participation in the rise of social media and some of these important companies. Obviously, an organization like Facebook creates community, and yet we also know that it's been a source for spreading disinformation. To what extent, from your kind of inside view of things, have social media platforms added to the polarization that we have, as opposed to creating the kind of sense of community that everybody says we really want?
I think one of the things that was interesting that we learned at Facebook very early on is that a lot of, particularly in Facebook, I think Twitter can be a different example because you can be anonymous and you can kind of have a different persona. But generally at Facebook, we have what's called a real name, real world culture when I was there. And it was that, Facebook did not solve any of the problems that existed in human relationships. So, there's a very famous complaint, Facebook would show me pictures of my ex-girlfriend. Well, you probably have pictures of your ex-girlfriend somewhere in your house. That's a problem you have in life that but the thing that happens with social media is that it accelerates the good and the bad. And so all of a sudden, you can build community. You can organize protests very quickly, but you can also tear somebody down very quickly. You can say things that you wouldn't do, probably wouldn't do in real life. And I think that is one of the kind of balances that is very tough, is that there are the tremendous positives around community, around organizing, around solidarity, and then these negatives where it really does take down the barriers to things that sometimes it should be harder to have barriers to make a death threat, for instance. It should be these things. And I think the additional piece of what we call kind of content optimization is a human relationship that's very tough is, for instance, unfriend me now if you disagree with me, or I'm unfriending you when I disagree with you. That is an instinct that feels good. It's impossible to do maybe in real life with your uncle or your parents, but it's so easy digitally, and it just reinforces some of these silos that are negative. And I think that it's this balance and this tough trade-off between that's been such a struggle.
But let me follow up on that. One of the things, obviously, that Facebook does is, through the algorithms, it, in a sense, narrows your community to people that they think you want to hear from or see. Doesn't that, in a sense, intensify the siloing that we've seen across media, whether it's, the way cable is viewed, the way the internet has fractured communication? Is there no way out of that? That's obviously, it gets all of us to spend more time, supposedly. That's the theory. And yet there seems to be a downside to that in terms of what it does to giving people access to information or ideas that may not conform with their own.
Absolutely. And I think, this concept of filter bubbles is, very much algorithmic, and it is also, to some extent our own behavior that models off of. And I think that's what is such a challenge because, to some level, to serve people their vegetables is the metaphor that's often used. People don't like vegetables, right? They like eating sugar. And I think it's very tough to say, oh, here's a product that, says actually you should see a bunch of opinions you disagree with and news maybe you're not interested in. I think it is important, though, and I think that role is one that is being explored more. I think one of the things that is interesting about it is, and when you look in particular at Russia, it was, and some of the election kind of interference, it is looking at places where they could pour gasoline on the fire, right? So it was, we understand that some of these issues are really kind of contentious, and it wasn't that they had created, a debate around Black Lives Matter or around gun rights. It was that they knew these were things that maybe divided Americans, and they could, with a little bit of time, effort, and money, essentially pour gasoline on the fire to make it even more contentious. And I think that is one of the dangers that we haven't addressed as we think about the kind of after effects of interference in 2016 is, it's not that they created disagreement, but what do we think about foreign entities and others who go out of their way to maximize our disagreement and that impact on our kind of democracy?
I want to talk about a couple of issues that are obviously very contentious right now in our politics. And I want to start with immigration. when we were doing this forum last fall, it was right the week that President Trump had ended the protection for the Dreamers and had given Congress 6 months basically to try to resolve it. Here we are, we're a month away from the deadline, nothing's been resolved. Ed, go back to your days in the Bush White House when the president was then pushing a comprehensive immigration reform package. You've seen this in a variety of iterations. Is there a way to come together on this issue? Do you see any likely progress on this? And why does this remain so insoluble when in a lot of ways a lot of people on both sides would like to get to a resolution?
It's both an economic and a cultural issue, and it is an issue where both bases, from the time of the Bush effort to get immigration reform done, and it collapsed. It was my first week in the White House as counselor to the president. The immigration bill collapsed on the floor of the Senate, and then Scooter Libby had his sentence commuted, and Pete Domenici came out against the war my first week, and I thought, well, surely it's going to get easier. It never really did, but
Are you saying correlation or causation?
Yeah, it was just coincidence. I don't think we knew at the time then what is clear now, which was that the collapse of that bill at that time had huge ramifications down the line, and the Republican Party has moved right, the Democratic Party has moved left on this issue. And so that middle ground has, gotten further and further apart. I think that it seems right now where we are, there is an opportunity here to get the Dreamers accommodated and to take that deal and do something on border security. Seems to me that that's gettable. I don't think you can probably get anything done relative to the broader immigration reform on chain migration or family-related migration, whatever you want to call it, and even the terminology is charged, and visas and things like that. It doesn't seem to me like you can get that done, but given the March 5th deadline and the need to accommodate the Dreamers, there's an opportunity here, and it seems like, if you believe the news reports, that there was some close to a deal that was about to happen that fell apart between President Trump and Senator Schumer. They may be able to patch that back together, but there's still long-term, challenges that we're going to face over this issue.
But in a sense, I mean, part of what seems to have happened at this point is that some of the bigger questions that were part of a comprehensive arrangement that would have dealt with the roughly 11 million undocumented,
right,
have now been conflated into protection for Dreamers in return for all those other things. So your view is that that's too high a hill.
It feels too high a hill to me.
Yeah. What do others think about why this is so insoluble? Why this? People talk about goodwill. People talk about, particularly on the Dreamers, a desire to do it, overwhelming support by the American people, and yet.
Can I add one thing, Dan, just before to turn it over to others? But there was an interesting piece in the New York Times, I think this past Sunday, and I don't often agree with what I see on the op-ed pages of the New York Times. I think it was Ross Dothit, and he said, one of the things that we've had in this immigration debate in terms of the negotiations are largely people in a room who tend to agree with each other, by and large, on the contours of the debate. And until you get, Senator Cotton and some others, and others further on the left too, into that room, I'm not sure you can get there from here.
Cotton and Congressman Gutierrez.
And Gutierrez would be a good example. Yeah.
Try to make that deal come together.
They've got or someone like them.
Well, and the invitation stands if anybody wants to come and actually go to an urban setting where there are a lot of people from other places and just go and walk around and meet people and see people's lives. I wish that I could give everybody the eyes that I have to see the community, the heart to feel the community that I feel when you're there, because it isn't. I think the people in the rooms, it's just a bunch of abstractions to them. As a mayor who had to govern a city, it was, these are the people who live in my city. If you want my police officers to be acting as ICE agents, you are creating less safety for everybody in the city. because no one's going to call the police when a crime is committed. No one's going to be willing to be a witness to a crime. No one's going to call up and say, yes, I saw the shooting, I want to talk to you. Because if their entire life in this country is at stake, there's no way they're going to call the police. And everybody is less safe in a place where people don't feel safe calling the police. We had just, when this issue of sanctuary cities came up, we had just, of course, had years in this country of having the conversation about communities of color not feeling safe calling the police, and doing everything we can in our power to make sure we're building that trust and everybody feels safe calling the police. Like, those are real issues on the ground that local leaders have to deal with. And the fact that people are in rooms, they're not out talking with people, they're not saying, okay, how do we come together as a country to make sure we're thriving as people? What's the realistic impact here on people's lives, on our economy? And you can see it when you walk around the city. And there's no way around the fact that I think this immigration issue is to the fore so strongly right now, because issues of race are to the fore so strongly. And the nationalism in the country right now, which in America has always been tied to race and racism, is so, everyone is so agitated about it. On the left and on the right, at the top, at the bottom, everybody's agitated about it. And when everybody's agitated, it comes out in all kinds of ways and people behave weirdly.
But go out from the city, the Twin Cities, into the suburbs, into the exurbs, farther away. How big is that diameter in which people feel about that issue the way you're talking about, and where it stops, and people have a different view of what immigration does to the United States, the people who are concerned about it, scared about it, who feel there's too much of it? How do you put those two together?
Well, I mean, I think the Venn diagram of places where people are super worried about immigration and places where people, where immigrants of color are not represented in great numbers, I think that Venn diagram is almost completely overlapping. And I mean, this country has to grapple with that issue everywhere all the time. As mayor, my mission, what I ran on, was to be very openly talking about and finding solutions for racial inequities and seeking racial equity. And that includes on the immigration front. Because the immigrants, I mean, the president himself has opinions about which immigrants are okay and which immigrants are not. He had language for it that I don't think I'm allowed to use here. But it corresponded entirely to countries that are primarily white and countries that primarily are not.
And countries that don't want to come here. Folks from Norway is not trying to immigrate to the United States of America. Sorry. They're just not. They told you they didn't want to come here. I think part of this is that there has been for a while, there has been this is a coming to head of this anti-immigrant sentiment that has been sweeping the world. And so if you look at Brexit, if you look at in Germany, places all in the UK, all across the world, there is an anti-immigrant sentiment that has been sweeping the globe. And so the 2016.
What do you think caused that?
I think it's the othering of people. It's exactly what the mayor said, what Betsy said, is that there are folks, we hear about, for instance, Syrian refugees for a long time. We heard about them on the news every single day for well over a year. And it is the othering, the fact that these are folks in this other situation of whom there are many people in this country who have never met an actual immigrant, let alone anyone of Syrian background. And I think it's the othering of folks, the fear of the unknown that is exacerbated when we mix in ethnocentrism and nationalism with a little bit of because populism is nothing but a thin ideology that is always mixed with a thick ideology. And so like Bernie Sanders, he was an economic populist. Donald Trump's populism also encompassed some of economics, but it also encompassed a little racism, in my opinion, a little ethnocentrism, some little nationalism sprinkled in on top. And that matters. And so now folks are thinking about the economy, their well-being in this country, tied to particularly this anti-immigrant sentiment, because that is the brand of populism most recently that they have been exposed to.
But it does flow both ways. One of the facts that I learned yesterday that I can't stop thinking about is that most Democrats in this country don't know a police officer. And as somebody who found herself at the head of the chain of command of a police department, having never been a police officer, and the lessons I learned from that, which we'll be talking about in my study group, which everyone should come to, that is important too, because that speaks to the conversation around policing in this country as much as anything else. If you can't understand that everybody wearing a uniform is a human being, we're not going to be able to craft the solutions we need to around policing either.
I just want to say one last thing, Dan. One last thing. The other problem is that we have an entire conversation about immigration and immigrants in this country as though, like by default, immigrants are a threat. Mm-hmm. And every single piece surrounding the conversation is about the threat that immigration poses to our very ways of life. We do, and part of that framing is because, to be frank, the folks on the right have done a really great job at framing the conversation, and people on the left have not. And so when we are approaching the conversation from the vantage point that immigration is in fact a threat, it is very hard to have a real baseline, frank conversation about real policy because now we have ventured into these cultural aspects that folks are very deeply rooted in. So, like, I can't have a frank conversation with you if you're talking to me like all the Dreamers are MS-13 gang members. Like, that is a fundamental difference that I have with your basis of coming to the conversation. So we cannot even have a frank policy conversation because I can't get past that piece.
Or every Somali person is a terrorist.
Adam,
You know,
before you start, I want to turn to the audience in a couple of minutes. I want Adam to have his word, and then I have a question to pose to each of you for a brief answer, and then we'll start taking questions from the audience. So if you want to line up at the mics, please do.
Yeah, and I'll say this as a Democrat, but also as an immigrant and somebody who grew up in New Mexico, which is has a very unique, I think, understanding in this country of immigration and border issues. You know, one of the things that Ed, you had mentioned, I really think about is how much different the world we've been living in if the Bush comprehensive education reform would change. You know, there's a world where maybe Barack Obama doesn't become president, but a world where, you know, a lot of things that have poisoned this country since then didn't happen as well. And I think it's an important lesson because Democrats were a primary reason why that agreement didn't happen. And there was this idea that someday we could pass a better deal. Ted Kennedy is very famous for regretting turning down a deal with Nixon on universal health care because someday he could get a better deal. And one of the things, and I was not so long ago, interested in politics, activism as a university student, and no one ever taught me about compromise. No one ever taught me about making the deal, right? It was easier to be extreme. And I will say that just remember that the idea that we can someday probably get a better deal, so don't take a compromise now, is one that you should just remember often fails. And I don't think that's a lesson maybe you learn right away, but it is something in the same way that as you think about how we care about these issues, and you care about immigration, you care about civil rights, we care about justice, it's, you know, as Betsy will say, as others will say, you know, these things are compromises often, and then you try and improve them, but, you know, we think about the times we missed, and we could just be living in such a different world, and it's a tragedy that we should think about as we have these conversations.
This is a perfect segue into what I want to ask all of you. And as you think of the audience here of young people, let's say you had a magic wand. What would you say to them, you know, one small thing they could do, or what can students do to try to do exactly what you're talking about, you've all talked about in one way or another? Create a more civil conversation, create an environment in which there could be compromise, create a situation in which the polarization lessens a little bit. So we'll start with Adam and then come back this way.
You know, it is probably easiest now in your lives to be in touch with people who are different with you. You're from places, you went to college, you can meet people at different colleges. You know, you will increasingly start to narrow your range of experiences and people. You'll move to a city or a suburb, and you'll be surrounded by more and more people like you, and it can be important now to try and build those bridges and keep in touch with people who are different politically, who are having different experiences. The good thing about social media, the good thing about Facebook others is you can learn about people's lives. And, you know, I think back a lot to as I was working in politics as a young man, like a lot of my friends were in Iraq, and I could like see them on Facebook go through their experience, and I, you know, could remember that. And even though I hadn't, you know, kind of had not had that experience, I was at least aware of it. And we know so much people are siloing off and not even being able to share that experience. Take this time to like, don't be the people who defriend and cut people out of your lives, because it doesn't get any easier to make these connections across differences. You're only going to get harder and harder to make those.
Scott?
I'm going to go back to immigration for 10 seconds because I didn't get to say anything, but I'm going to give a slightly more optimistic view of the possibility that something gets done, and I'll tell you why. Donald Trump and the Republicans got a taste of what it's like to pass a bill and have a pep rally when they did the taxes, and I think above everything else, he wants to be viewed as someone who's getting things done and winning and movement and fixing and so on and so forth. That's a powerful motivator. Number two, I don't think the Democrats can afford to let their base down on this issue and fail these dreamers. And number three, I think the dreamers have done a terrific job of organizing and turning public opinion in their favor. So all of these things are not policy but tactical, but I think they will ultimately add up to a deal that fixes the dreamers, gets us some kind of border security, possibly a reform to one or two pieces of the immigration system. I don't think it'll go as far as the comprehensive efforts of the past, but my prediction is the Republicans want to look like they know how to govern, the Democrats don't want to fail the dreamers, and they're going to wind up doing something. My advice to you all, to turn to Dan's question, is you need to think real hard about the divisions that exist in this country along education and geography. I've written about this a great deal this year. I'm going to talk about it in my classes. But whether or not you have a college degree is a great predictor of how you view politics, and where you live right now is a great predictor. Hillary Clinton won 88 of the largest 100 counties in America, and Donald Trump won almost everything else. Where you live and what your educational attainment is, more than your party and more than anything else, is dividing us politically. But it's not just that we're casting different votes. We don't trust each other. We don't like each other. We don't know each other. There is a lot of that going on in this country. And the question we all have to ask ourselves repeatedly as Americans is, are we still in this together or not? And increasingly, I have become concerned that some people don't believe we are. So I want you all to focus on that question and to think about the things that are dividing us and how we can overcome those divisions.
Symone?
You don't even have the NFL anymore.
I love Scott Jennings. What I would say to the young people in this room, as a young person myself, someone that graduated not 4 years ago, is that I want you to remember that every single major movement and shift that has happened in this country has been pushed and fueled and brought over the top by young people. You know, John Lewis wasn't always a congressman. He was a college student, someone that in modern day they would call a pesky, meddlesome millennial that always kept showing up at the meeting and wouldn't be quiet. And so in saying that, the things that you do not like about this world, the increasing polarization, not just of our politics, but of our communities, we are the ones to help bring about a change to fix that. So I would encourage you to, one, remember that, and two, have intentional conversations. So be intentional about creating environments where you can engage in respectful conversations with folks who are different from you in various ways, shapes, and forms. And two, approach those conversations understanding, not trying to win someone over to your side. We are now engaged in conversations where it's all about how can I get my point across, the cable news style of having a conversation, instead of truly trying to understand where someone is coming from so we can mutually come to a point of understanding.
Well, I'll pick up on what all three of my fellows said and add to it a little bit. One of the great things about being a candidate for statewide office in particular is that you go places you would never otherwise go, and you see things you would never otherwise see, and meet people you would never otherwise meet. And it changed my thinking on a number of different fronts. When you sit in a jail with inmates and you talk about their experiences and talk about addiction and recovery with addicts, when you go into the coal mines with the coal miners, go out on the port with the pilot boat captains and on the Chesapeake Bay with the oystermen, when you go into public housing communities, when you go places otherwise you would not go, and you listen, it changed my view on a number of issues. It changed my view on criminal justice reform, and it changed my view on the approach to addiction and recovery, on the need for education reforms, and there were a lot of things that, as a candidate, I found myself thinking, I need to take a fresh look at this, and I've been wrong about some of my views. Now, if I hadn't gone and met and been in these places, that I wouldn't have had that experience. And so I would say, in addition to this, if you're from a northeastern city and one of your classmates is from a rural community in Nebraska, go home for for a break. And go to Omaha.
There you go. Well, you might need to go to Scotts Bluff.
And see, spend some time there. And if you're from a rural community in the Midwest, go to California with a friend in LA and spend some time there, because there is no substitute for actually being somewhere and meeting people from a different perspective.
I mean, if you ask me what would be my message for you about all of this, the first thing I would say is tend to your inner and emotional and spiritual life first, or while you're doing everything else. The invitation, Harvard, I've been here 5 minutes, and I can tell you, you could probably hear and be reminded every day that Harvard is an adventure and an opportunity for you. It is not a test to see if you're worthy to live the rest of your life well. Harvard is a huge adventure and opportunity, and if you can cultivate that sense of adventure while here and carry that with you, whatever you do afterwards, it's going to be easier to think about who you are and what you want to do for the rest of your life. And to cultivate that compassion, to learn how to not hold on to resentment, to be open to other people's experience and to learn from it. I'm a recovering alcoholic, 28 years. I got sober midway through college, which is why I'm like, tend to yourself and what's going on with you, because that will stand you in good stead the rest of your life. And the conversation that Ed and I had briefly about recovery last night will always be very meaningful to me. There will never be another moment where somebody can say something about Ed Gillespie and I won't be like, excuse me. That would be what I would say, is anything that's getting in the way of you experiencing compassion for somebody who disagrees with you is an opportunity for you to figure out anywhere that you're stuck with yourself internally. It's not just an external situation. It can be an internal opportunity. That's what I would say. I know that's kind of woo-woo and touchy-feely for a politician. But I have found that cultivating courage, cultivating integrity, cultivating compassion, that will stand you in good stead whatever you do for the rest of your life, including running for office and being able to look yourself in the eye every morning while you do it.
That was terrific advice from everybody, and I hope all of you absorb that and think about it and take it forward. We will now turn to questions. In 8 minutes, Mr. Gillespie will be excused. So if we run slightly past 6, Ed will depart, but we'll try to keep it going. Start here. Name, a little bit, where you are in the college, question, and then we'll go.
Awesome. Thank you. My name's Kat Geisler. I represent Florida International University. I just wanted to talk briefly in noticing all your guys' comments about, like how Mr. Gillespie said, there is even polarization in terms. There's polarization in the way we word things. There's polarization in othering. Coming back to language, now for the sake of this question, if we assume kind of like a more constructivist standpoint in the sense that our society has lately been built in part as by what we are saying, what the president tweets, what panelists debate, I guess where I don't know where to stand as I enter this world of politics and activism, where do you know when to let the vocabulary of the century kind of ride out and take its societal changes as it always does, or when you should assume a more verbal activist role at the risk of adding to that polarization fire you mentioned?
Who wants to take that?
I'll say something in the terms of, so particularly if you want to, let's talk about immigration reform. In the conversation around immigration, you'll hear things such as chain migration. You'll hear illegal immigrants as opposed to family migration and undocumented individuals or undocumented immigrants. For me, I always take time to correct that conversation because the root of that conversation, in my opinion, is that's dog whistle language. And as a black woman in America, I am keenly aware of dog whistle language, and I'm sitting on ready every time. Because when we talk about when we say chain migration as opposed to family migration, chain migration lets us seemingly erase the fact that these folks have families. When many white people in America came to America via family or chain migration. But we weren't talking about chain migration, 50, 60, 80 years ago. So I think you have to, that's why knowledge is so important. And so a lot of times folks are not knowledgeable when they come to the conversation, and they're just griping and gripping on every single little thing. Some things that I would suggest are not, like, we don't need to argue about that. That is, in fact, the language of the moment. But for me, the backstory for so many of these, again, illegal immigrants as opposed to undocumented individuals, it is the othering and the dehumanization of folks when we talk about immigration. So I personally am always going to correct that language.
But I think to Scott's point earlier about hills to die on, if you're talking to somebody who's very ideologically opposed to you and is going to use that term no matter what, don't spend your entire life trying to convince somebody to do something. You can correct it, you move on, but pick your hills to die on.
Let's go up to the balcony.
Hi, I'm Andrew, and I'm an engineer, but I'm a partner of an HBS student. And over the past year, I've noticed that we become increasingly polarized, and it almost seems like we're living in two different realities. And I was wondering, if we were to have a constitutional convention tomorrow, if we were to rewrite the Constitution from scratch and codify our most fundamental values into law, do you think we could even do that in our current state? And if so, what would those values be?
Who's this question for?
Anyone who wants to take it?
I'll just say one thing. 2/3 of state legislative houses are currently in Republican control. So if there was a constitutional convention today, 2/3 of state legislative chambers across this country are currently under Republican control.
And they only need 2 or 3 more to actually, under the Constitution, call a constitutional convention, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
Actually, many state legislatures are presently considering calls for a constitutional convention.
Because 2/3.
There are several resolutions, and so
Just when you thought local politics
I don't know how many are going to pass,
matter.
but there's
All right,
a movement afoot.
so let's say there is a call for a constitutional convention. Who here has a couple of principles that you would say have to go into that Constitution?
Well, Dan, I think the point is it doesn't matter what principles we particularly, the good feeling people and the good people of this world sitting on this stage would like to go into the convention, because the reality of the fact that it matters that 2/3 of the state legislative chambers are in Republican control, because legislation such as bathroom bills, abortion bans, these are all things that have come out of a number of those state legislatures. And so the policies would reflect the policies that are currently the policies of the national and local Republican committees across the country. It would not necessarily reflect things such as the kind of comprehensive maybe criminal justice reform policies people on the left particularly would like to see in the states, because 2/3 of state legislative chambers are currently under Republican control.
I would probably call for the enslavement of black people to not be reinstated. I would probably say, yeah, let's let women vote. And I probably wouldn't put weapons in the founding document. We're the only nation in the world that mentions weapons in our founding document. Those first two, you understand, right? Like the slavery and women not voting were in the original Constitution, and let's not go back there. That's all I would say. It's kind of a joke, mostly, is what that was.
She does this a lot. She tells jokes, and then she explains that it is a joke, and then we all laugh.
Yes.
That's after 3 days.
You know what I think I would fear?
You guys are figuring one another out pretty quickly, aren't you?
If this actually occurred, I fear an assault on the First Amendment.
Because there's 5 things in the First Amendment.
And if there's a hill I would die on, it's that one.
Yes.
Because I think there's an assault on the First Amendment right now as it relates to the press, as it relates to what you can and can't say on a campus, as it relates to what you can and can't say really anywhere. And we may not like it, and I may not like what Symone says on TV one night, and she may not like what I say, but by golly, we have got to be free to speak. And that is the fundamental issue that we have in this country that other people don't have. So you know what? I believe there would be people that would try to put caveats and controls on what we can say, and that's a hill I would die on in the world that you described of a constitutional convention.
To you, sir.
Good evening. My name is Amos Jackson III, and I go to Howard University. My question is for Mrs. Hodges and Mr. Gillespie. Both of you ran political campaigns under 2 different administrations. So how do you believe the presidential elections and administrations affected your campaigns? And also, why do you think voter turnout is so low in local and state elections?
Well, do you mind if I go first, and then I can
Yeah, he's got 1 minute.
so that I don't have to leave after you speak and people think I've just stormed out. First of all, I went to to college right up the street at Catholic U. So spent my fair share of time at Howard, and glad to see you here today. In terms of the differences in running, for me it is very pronounced because in my 2014 Senate race, I was running as the out-of-power party in a midterm election, and I had wind at my back. And in last year, I was running with President Trump having just been elected, and I had a full force gale in my face. And so that was a different dynamic, very much so. But there was more to it than that as well, because the truth is I really enjoyed, and I share Betsy's point about the local issues. They're much more solutions-oriented. They're much more where people live, your roads, your schools, jobs, addiction and recovery, all these things where you can really have a significant impact. And I enjoyed that issue set much more running for governor than I did the federal issue set running for Senate. And I also, enjoyed, I just wasn't running as a check on a sitting president, which is the nature of a midterm election for a second term president of either party if you're the out-of-power party, but on here's what I would do as the executive, if entrusted with that, for the people of the Commonwealth of Virginia, and 21 specific detailed policy proposals. And I really wonked out, and I loved it, and I loved talking about those, and going to places where, as governor, you would play a role that you wouldn't as senator. It took me to more places, frankly, in the campaign. So both in terms of the environment, wind at your back versus wind at your face, but also the issue set, to me, the governor's race was much more enjoyable than the Senate race, although I lost it a lot bigger. So I didn't enjoy that part as much. No. So I'm off to catch a plane. It's great to be with you all today, and I look forward to seeing you on campus. Thank you.
See you, Ed.
See you, Thank you. There it is. See you guys. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Ed.
I would say the fact that Trump is the president and that there's just so much agitation right now was huge for me last year, because in municipal elections, people don't pay as much attention to it. People don't think it's as sexy. And I'll make the pitch for local government here. There's 100,000 elections every year, every other year. 99,900 of them are local. If you want to have an impact on your community and your world, work on local races, school board, county races, city council, mayor. That's where the action is, and that's where you can actually get something done. And I'll pitch that to you. I focused my entire adult life on local government for that very reason, because I could make change there. But what happened in my election, amongst a whole set of factors, were that a whole bunch of people really upset about what's happening nationally knew that one bit of control everybody has is their vote. And so they were like, well, the one thing I can do is vote. And these were people who never have voted in a municipal election. We didn't have them in our database, because when you run locally, you target, right, for the people who are actually likely to show up. So the targeting was wrong, and I knew that at the beginning. The mean on local government is the same, but the tails are very spread out. Any kind of thing can happen. And it was double the turnout, and that meant it was a whole bunch of people, and all they'd seen was the Star Tribune, and they had a very skewed picture of what I'd been doing as mayor. So that had an impact. It's just on turnout. People are going to vote. As far as what I'm telling you right now is people are going to vote this fall. People that have never seen the polls, they're going to be voting this fall, because they're upset about what's happening nationally, or they love it, or for whatever reason, but they are going to be showing up to the polls.
We have time for one more question, so we'll make sure we get all the way around the circle here.
Hi, my name is Zoe Williamson, and I go to Louisiana State University. My question is for Mrs. Sanders. So we discussed in the beginning of the panel how polarization is at the highest point that it's been in the history of America. And this is a really recent thing, because in the past 30 years, ideology and partisanship have kind of become intertwined, which was not true in the middle of the 20th century. And in the past couple of months, ever since the Trump presidency, a lot of Democrats in red states have gotten a lot of backlash for voting with their constituency. And how do Democrats in red states turn towards the ideological purity test that a lot of liberals are putting upon them?
So I think that's a good and interesting question. I would venture to say that not just since Donald Trump has been president, I think Democrats in red states have been getting flack for being Democrats in red states for a really long time. I think the role of the folks on the left, the people inside and adjacent to the Democratic Party apparatus, is not to set up these ideological purity tests. And so whether it's these ideological purity tests, and I think that is a danger when we do run the risk not being able to complete and play everywhere. But I do think there's a misconception that you can't be a progressive person in a red place, and I think of Jason Kander, who was running 21 points ahead of Secretary Clinton in the 2016 general election, who ran in Missouri, who ran for Senate, who was a veteran, who had a famous ad where he was blindfolded and he put together a very complicated gun in like less than 30 seconds while giving his like pitch to the voters, but who was really progressive, who talked about women's autonomy and criminal justice reform and all these other things, and was running 21 points ahead of Secretary Clinton in Missouri, a red place, for all practice, give or take some spots. So there's a common misconception, in my opinion, that we cannot both be that we can't talk about the issues in ways that are beneficial for everyone and be Democrats in red places. So I think we have to break down the ideological idea that that's not possible.
I do want to say one of the things I think is interesting for elected officials that troubles them is that particularly activists on both sides, they have a dual litmus test depending on their convenience. And so we want them to vote with their states if their states agree with our positions. But the moment their states don't agree with the position, we want them to be brave, right? And we want these things in the same person at the same times, right? You've got to vote with your state when I'm on, when it's the issue I agree with, and you got to stand up and be independent when it's the issue I don't agree with. And I think it is to an extent what I have seen over the last few years in politics is this idea that we lost at some point, which is that the table stakes of democracy, the table stakes of legislation was sometimes you would lose. Sometimes you'd fight really hard and you'd lose an election. Or you'd go to a bill and you wouldn't get everything in it. And that was okay because that was like the implicit bargain. I run an election sometimes and I'm going to lose it. But that's fine, like there are losers. And what we have seen that has been so poisonous is this idea that losing is not supposed to be part of the bargain anymore. You know, big concerns in a lot of these elections, in the Roy Moore, Doug Jones, is Roy Moore going to concede because he can't possibly lose an election because that's a betrayal on, or on legislation, we can't possibly not get everything we want, heritage action and some of the left push it. And, this is the box that I think activists in particular have placed on both sides because it's an escalating war. Because if they can get away with it on the right, we have to push it on the left too. And it is tough because at the end of the day, elected officials are answerable to voters, and the voters that turn out have been the ones that are, pushing this as well. And so I think one of the things that will be interesting to watch this year is even in a year of high partisanship, the turnout is going to be really interesting to see what that has an impact on, because higher turnout does distribute things in a different way, as I think Betsy knows, than a lower turnout election does.
But I would add that just on this idea of the ideological purity test, that is not new on the left. That is not new on the left. That's been around for a really long time. But I think what is new is now that there are more women and more people of color, especially running for office, the way that those purity tests get laid on to us candidates or us elected officials, it brings with it, often unintentionally, the baggage of sexism and racism, and unintentionally, and I don't know, people don't always know that that's what they're doing. And so when those things coincide, then the purity test becomes particularly unhelpful and unnuanced and very painful to walk through and experience.
The last thing I want to note is, in terms of the ideological purity test on the left, the problem, and one of the things that I'm discussing in my study group, so for all the folks that are here, come see me, on the left, part of the issue of the warring factions is a lot of the grassroots folks, they just want you to be right. They do not care about winning. And I am currently at the point where I would like to win. And I would like to win, and I would like to win a lot, particularly in 2018 and maybe in 2020. And so because there are folks on the ideological spectrum on the left, because there are all these different warring factions, it's like Game of Thrones, there are some kingdoms on the left of the Democratic Party that do not care about winning. They just want to be right. And so how do you reckon and communicate with and work with folks that are not invested in the root of winning and getting more Democrats into office? That is a real challenge for the Democratic Party right now.
There are going to be some very interesting study groups here this spring. For those of you who are visitors, you can try to look in later. For those of you who are Harvard students, take advantage of it. Come to them as often as you can. The moderator gets one last question. It is a single-word answer. It is Super Bowl weekend. Vikings or Eagles? Remember where you're sitting.
No. It's Patriots or Eagles.
Patriots.
Yeah. Let's give her a heart attack.
Thanks for just grinding
that
in. Thanks for just grinding that in.
See, that's what happens when you sit next to the former mayor of Minneapolis. Sorry. Patriots versus Eagles.
Vikings.
Eagles. Free Meek Mill. Free Meek Mill. Yes, boo me. Eagles.
I'm with Tom Brady, Patriots.
Pass?
Boo, Adam.
The Eagles.
All right.
Gradually.
Thank you all very
honestly, if I had to
much.
pick,
I encourage all of you. There's a reception afterwards. Please join us all. Thank you.